Thanks, I've got the. Yeah.
some more one the people that is showing people.
Okay, otherwise the temperature is going to be too low. They should put it put different station on the CO2. Where's the PARI? It's for the next.
Okay, nobody's a presentation, so it's in any good enough order. I'm trying to think what I wish to do. What is the last name? I still remember it's from ECT. 7 years.
I seem to remember.
Order. I thought we could start with Q. Yes, no? Okay, that's fine. Or we could start with Anne, because yours is a specific area. It's not a very limited, very small geographical area. Yeah. Expansive of countries, and you're happy with it. So thank you. So
We are back.
Gentlemen at the back, can we start?
Yes. Yes. This is your call? Oh, I thought the punch is coming.
there's been very interesting discussion in South Africa, but especially in the work of organizations like LARC about the way in which the role has been played by traditional authorities. And we wanted to try and use this session to really think the question of what is the place of traditional authorities in state capture. One of the things we've seen quite a lot is that the land redistribution program in South Africa has been captured by a certain elite in rural areas. What we've also seen a lot of is that when it comes to mining deals, there's a way in which between the ruling party and traditional authorities, that elite in rural areas has really banded together in interesting ways and has, in many ways, left ordinary people out of the conversation. And so we want to try and begin to think, is this something related to the phenomenon of state capture, and how does it relate? Anne Meager, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town, has recently released an absolutely fascinating book. She's going to talk about the work she's been doing in the Eastern Cape. Followed by Brighton Gould, now is a postdoctoral fellow in political studies at WITS, who's going to talk about, well, Ghana, but putting it in the context of several other countries on the continent. And Robert Thornton, who is in anthropology at WITS University, is going to talk about the farm, the chieftaincy, and the mine as three social forms in South Africa that we need to think together when we're thinking about some of the recent phenomena that we're discussing here. So, without further ado, Anne.
Thanks very much. I've titled this talk chiefly Politics and State Capture the Past in the Present, and I was asked to do this only a couple of days ago, so forgive me if it's a little half-baked, and I was asked to go first this afternoon because my talk is very much grounded in the study that Pico Velelo and I have just completed on the westerly section of the Eastern Cape, the Chris Hani district, if you like, in present terms. But to go back, where does this notion of capture come from? The British justified conquest of the Eastern Cape on the grounds that British law would free the people from the tyranny of their chiefs. And the British set out to capture the institution of chieftaincy. It was their target, their purpose was to reduce the power of the chiefs, to change the power of the chiefs, to get the chiefs to submit to British law and to the imperial will. So this notion of capture begins on the other foot, if you like. But popular support for the chiefs made it difficult for the colonizers to implement their project in any whole-scale way. They had to introduce British law piecemeal. They broke down the power and authority of the chiefs in a targeted way, in a piecemeal kind of way. And so they also found that over time their administrators vacillated between hard and soft approaches towards the institution of the chieftaincy, and the building up of an intellectual elite, a middle class through missionary education was also a slow and piecemeal process. And not everyone who went through the missionary system abandoned a sense of belonging that was located in a genealogical order, that being the origin of the authority of chiefs. Now, that's the early period, but up into this picture we must insert this endemic rivalry that there always was between chiefs. Prior to colonial intervention, throughout the period of colonialism, segregation, throughout the period of apartheid. Rivalry between chieftaincies and the rivalry between different narratives of authenticity and legitimacy was also part of this picture. But the first time you see a reversal of capture from the British and the colonizers capturing the institution is in the apartheid era, when you have very ambitious, very powerful individuals like Kaiser Matanzima turning this around to suit their own ends. And Kaiser Matanzima captures the state, if you like. Captures the local state. He invents for himself certain statuses, certain paramountcies of the chieftaincy. He ensures that resources go through him. He plays off one magistrate against another, the chief magistrate against the Department of Bantu Affairs Administration, and so he manipulates in order to capture. So there's in this period of apartheid rule, you have a systematic politics being generated around that capturing of the state and state resources and the former authority of the colonial state by these apartheid-created chiefs. That's not to say that Kaiser Matanzi was a puppet. Far from it. In fact, he reduced the officers of the apartheid state to puppets of his own. He played them. He played them. So there's a complicated relationship here. That's the point here. The relationship between the chiefs and between the state that is created first by colonialism and later by apartheid is a complex one. They derive their authority and their legitimacy in different ways, from different kinds of institutions, from different systems of law. So customary law and genealogy on the one side and institutionalized British law on the other becomes the sort of contrast, if you like. And the chiefs are playing both systems all the time. They do not play within one system only. They play both systems and between the systems through their rivalries and their complicated relationships with each other. So this is a complex, dense, intensely fraught landscape that we're talking about. And it hasn't stopped. This continues through to the post-colonial moment. There's nothing abandoned about this old style of making this kind of complex politics. And the post-apartheid state doesn't behave in any substantially different way from its predecessors. The post-apartheid state requires the chiefs to make modernist changes, to reform in line with the Constitution. Well, every single political dispensation prior to this has done the same thing, has said, conform to our institutions, conform to the rules of the state. And then we will play much more nicely with you. Well, this democratic government is doing much the same thing, and the principles of the Constitution may be precious from a democratic perspective, but they're no less threatening than abandoning polygamy or anything else that previous dispensations might have demanded. So, and similarly, the post-colonial government, this democratic government, has raised the status of chiefs somewhat, but hasn't really given them more authority or more control over resources. You have in these rural areas municipalities staffed by government officials, and you have in the rural village chiefs who are gatekeepers to those communities. And so that tension between the state and the chiefs acting as gatekeepers and the state holding back on resources, this complication continues. It's not new and it's not different from the past. So that complexity often ends up in some kind of impasse, some kind of failure of initiative, some kind of dependence, if you like. There's an interdependence that's going on. The chiefs are dependent on the state for resources, and the state is dependent on the chiefs for access to communities, for understanding communities, for agreement on the part of communities to participate in various modernist projects. So it's a complicated and tense business. I think that one has to then say, so where do we go from here? What do we learn from this past? What is it that one needs to do differently, that one needs to see being done differently? And the first of these, of course, is to understand this interdependence, and that to acknowledge that chiefs are as dependent as municipal officials doesn't make it any easier, but it does mean that divisions of labor, divisions of responsibility, these sorts of things need to be sorted out, and they are not very clear to people. There's just endless resentment and a lack of action. Under these chiefs in contemporary South Africa, we have 17 million people living, and 17 million people are caught up in this complicated impasse. I should hasten to say there are no huge resources in the area that I've been working in, so there are no mining interests. The kind of things we're going to hear from Bright don't occur in this area. It's an area that is relatively overcrowded, relatively denuded of grazing, where the livestock carrying capacity exceeds the carrying capacity sometimes tenfold. It's not an area where there is a scrambling over resources, so the dependence is even more acute. This second point, so we have to learn and understand this dependence and this interdependence. The second point to make is that there is, in fact, a crisis, a rural crisis, an environmental crisis. There's been agricultural collapse. There's huge disaffection on the part of the youth. Nothing is going on in many of these areas. And this is really a ticking time bomb. And the chiefs can do nothing about it. The municipal authorities are not doing anything about it. So this crisis is something else that needs to be recognized. And there's a general sort of neglect on the part of the state to look at the rural areas. Somehow there's still that residual thing that it's where migrants go to live when they've retired and they're out of the economy. That is not so. The population in the rural areas is increasingly young, increasingly unemployed, and increasingly dependent on the social grants for their children and their mothers. So this is a complicated thing. The third lesson I think we need to be learning from this is that handing out more land on its own will not solve the problem. There is no magic bullet in handing out land without agricultural support. If there is no support for farming, and much of this land needs tremendous rehabilitation before it's going to yield anything. If there's no agricultural support on farms that might be acquired, people will end up living on those farms off social grants, and it will help no one. There will be no improvement for people. So we need to be banging of the drum, land plus agricultural support. It's simply, at the moment, the debate's all about on how to get land, whether you pay for it or you don't pay for it. But the land on its own is not going to deliver the goods. The way forward has to be a pairing of a planning for how to use the land, a planning for how to give agricultural support to those who are placed on that land, and some kind of ongoing steady support for farming on that land, so that the dependence is decreased, so that the crisis is ameliorated, and so that the young have some real hope that they can, through their own efforts, get out of this depression. So that's the third point that I wanted to make. And then the fourth point I wanted to make is that this dual legitimacy is probably there to stay for a very long time. People believe in democracy, they queue up, they vote, they make their cross, but they also believe in leadership that comes down through genealogy. The one is not more legitimate than the other for many people. They need a sense of belonging, a sense of naming, a sense of their own past, as well as they need a sense of how to work in the present and in the future. So this dual legitimacy, not something one can simply wish away, or by examining a society in terms of its structure, saying we'll abolish the chiefs. It's not so simple. It is not going to happen in any uncontested way, even if the state tried to do that. So
2 minutes.
I'm almost done. So a small number of localities in this area lost their chiefs at the time of conquest through the Mfecane or through the frontier wars. And so there is a voice saying we don't want chiefs. There are areas that make that argument. But there are areas who believe very profoundly. So the picture that I'm painting is that there's no one size fits all. And there are good and bad chiefs. So some communities feel more loyal and more attached to their chiefs than others. So it's a complicated picture that isn't going to simplify anytime soon. But if we focus on rural development, we need to be aware of this complexity. And since we're at PARI, I would like to challenge PARI to set some researchers onto this whole area of rural politics, rural social change. So much work is needed, precisely because it's so diverse across the country.
Thank you. Right.
Thank you, Chair. You know, there is a popular saying in Ghana, and it is often cited by Kofi Annan. It was, but now God rest his soul. And it was like, after the wise person has spoken, the young and then the inexperienced must refrain from saying anything further. So, having find myself...
Okay, moving on to the next.
And now, you know, being cornered between two luminaries, between two experts, I think I must first make a disclaimer that I'm not an expert on this subject as compared to the two. But what I would do is to just share my opinion and my thoughts with you, which might not necessarily be true, but they constitute my opinion on the issue at hand. And then my topic is on troubled royalty, that is the relevance or otherwise of chiefs in post-colonial Africa. And then when I was thinking about what to write a couple of weeks ago, I was confronted with one particular issue, and that was who are the traditional leaders that the organizers or the framers of this conference were discussing. And then I was convinced that they were talking about a group of individuals or people who, through their ancestral lineage or by royal bloodline, occupy the throne or stool of a particular area. However, even as I thought so, I was conscious of the fact that if one studies the history of black people, one is bound to come to the realization that truly not all chiefs or all traditional leaders in post-colonial Africa truly do have the royal bloodline, royal blood running through their veins. And I'll provide a context to this fact. We all know that the institution of leadership or traditional leadership in Africa dates back to the Ghana Empire, which existed between 300 to 1240 CE. And then from this time to the 1987, the 1870s, chiefs, had absolute power to make, amend, and implement laws and dispense justice without fear nor favor. They managed to use these laws to bring their people food, water, and of course, through traditional herbs to give them good health. But however, starting from 1870 to the 1900s, the walls of the continent was battered by European imperialist aggression, invasion, and subsequent conquest. And then in the words of Kenya's Ali Mazrui in his TV documentary, which he used to showcase somewhere in the 1980s, he said that the number of Europeans who came to the walls of Africa and then actually conquered or went to the dinner table to share and partition the cake of Africa is often best described in the following derogatory terms. That is Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, and to some who are even generous to the continent, they even refer to some part of the continent as Arabophone Africa. However, when these Europeans penetrated and it took our continent, took the continent, they co-opted traditional leaders into their services. Hence, one could say chiefs were the first civil servants to be hired on the continent. And of course, without pension benefit. So these chiefs, the ones who were hired, the colonial masters had the power to fire anyone who was insubordinate or who was not willing to bend to their rules. And then because of this, it sort of intimidated our chiefs, who through the aggression of their colonial masters or through the form of the indirect rule, sometimes embarked on invasion or conquest of their fellow tribes, captured their own people, and sold them into slavery. And then, so this system went on until the late 1950s, where a group of nationalists rose up to fight back and reclaim the continent. Hence, when the African continent was actually independent or liberated from Accra in 1957 to Pretoria in 1994, the new liberators or the struggle stalwarts, such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Jomo Kenyatta, and of course Sam Nujoma and others, saw chiefs not as partners in development, but as traitors who could not be partnered with or be brought on board in the nation-building agenda. Chiefs were therefore relegated to the position of performing merely cultural and religious roles. However, starting from the late 1990s, there was a new movement. There were new groups of chiefs who managed to assert their positions. And this movement took place within three different but overlapping phases. The first movement of chiefs comprised those who sought to assert themselves to become prominent in their societies, but then they were oppressed by the regimes. And such chiefs can be found in countries such as in Congo, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia.
Sorry, can I, excuse me? Sorry, we can't hear each other in the room.
And then the second group comprises chiefs who are trying to also be assertive, but then because they are not being recognized within their local communities, they have tried or sought to perform local government functions by policing, collecting rent, and then in some cases also dispensing justice, but without the knowledge of central government. And a third group of chiefs are the most interesting, and that's going to be the focus of my presentation now, are those who have mobilized massive tribal support behind them. And then because states cannot simply do away with them, these states have actually recognized them and then entrenched their rule within their national constitution, and in some instances, extended their rights by providing traditional authorities act for them. And such chiefs can be found in South Africa, in Ghana, in Botswana, Zimbabwe. In this context, chiefs are allowed to, of course, perform their traditional roles, but the situation or the cases of service delivery, such as provision of water, construction and maintenance of roads, health services, primary education, have been withdrawn from chiefs, and these roles were being performed by chiefs previously, prior to colonial, but now they've been withdrawn from chiefs and have been given to local government authorities. However, there is a caveat to this. Chiefs can perform these roles, but they need to raise their own funds through donations, royalties, sale of lands. And this is where the problem has often occurred in Africa. For a while, some chiefs are actually much more accountable and loyal to their citizens by providing regular and periodic accounts, such as what happens in Muyezi local community in Limpopo, somewhere in Guyana. Chiefs are very loyal, so they provide periodic accounts to their citizens as to how much came in, how much land was sold, and then what the money was used for. Other chiefs have actually see themselves as the total embodiment of community values and virtues, and they are beyond reproach or beyond accountability. In fact, one of such chiefs happens to be the Ashanti King of Ghana, Otumfuo Osei-Tutu. He, in 1994, established the Otumfuo Education Fund, where you have organizations such as Unilever and other prominent individuals who contribute funds into this fund. And the purpose of this fund is to provide scholarship for needy but brilliant students. However, from the time it was established in 1999 to the present time, citizens of Kumasi are growing discontent because they don't know how much has come in, how much has gone out. And this situation is not only, limited to Ghana, but extends or cuts across the continent. And one such place is a Bapupa Muleke local community in Northwest Province. As by 2016, the citizens or residents of this community stormed the palace of the local chiefs, demanding for millions of rands, which have gone missing from the community's account. So if chiefs as was said by Mahmoud Mamdani in his 1996 book, Citizens and Subjects, that if chiefs have truly, to some extent, outlived their usefulness, why do we still maintain the institution? Why do we still keep them? Why do governments still pay them salaries, which could have been used for service delivery? But it seems that there is one common trend cutting across Africa, and that is there are so many factors, but which are actually captured in my paper, but for purposes of time, I will limit only, I will say only one, and that is for electoral strategy. Chiefs are known to mobilize or to command enormous or massive support among their citizens, and therefore they can mobilize their citizens for or against any particular individual or party that they wishes. Therefore, political, figures are actually a bit reluctant to scrap such an institution, because once you take that step, it means that it might backfire on you. It was therefore not surprising that somewhere in July, it was found that the president, South Africa's president, went to the Zulu king and he was engaging with him. It appeared in the media. One party said, no, he was actually kneeling before the Zulu king. The other party said, no, he was actually showing the king some cattle in the book. So, you see, these are two diverse scenarios, but whichever position you take, you look at it, it signifies or it demonstrates the powerful nature of this institution. It's something which cannot easily be done with. But I will conclude by saying that Europe had a number of traditional leaders. It was governed by monarchs, kings and queens, and often assisted by dukes. However, this institution in Europe has paved way for democratic governance. And in those cases where this institution exists or have prevailed or have survived, it is only the top hierarchy which have actually prevailed or survived. In cases such as in Sweden, in the Netherlands and England, only the top hierarchy. So therefore, as an African, you can draw inspiration from such regimes. And then I must say that even though our democratic exercise has not been so smooth, but that does not provide grounds for the use of chieftaincy or traditional leadership. It is important that in all local communities or in all villages, that is quite, I'm taking quite a separate position from the observation made by Prof, that it is important that all local, in all areas, whether it is in a village, whether it's in a city, our communities must be governed by individuals whom the people feel are competent enough, have the vision, have the capability and the ability to actually adopt programs, implement them successfully, rather than by having someone rule individuals by simply based on their claim to royal bloodline. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, go for it.
Okay. My name is Robert Thornton. I'm an anthropologist. I know that sounds like Alcoholics Anonymous, something like that. But when I've been talking to people, they say, what's an anthropologist doing here? Well, my previous work has been in medical anthropology, HIV/AIDS, sexual networks, chieftaincy, and most recently a book on traditional healers, sangomas. And that has taken me into areas which many people don't go. And I'm going to make the point, they don't go there because these are effectively opaque to social sciences. We don't have access. For a number of reasons, I've obtained access to chiefship, to Sangoma Dom, chiefship, the farm, and the mine. My current research is on mining, in fact. But, okay, let me start. What I'm talking about is what I call South African canonical social forms. And you'll see why I'm calling them forms. The farm, the mine, and the chieftain, or chieftaincy, in the devolved post-colonial state. In South Africa, the chieftain, the mine, the farm, constitute what I call canonical social forms, that is, types of social organization that remain largely opaque to social analysis and resistant to political control. They are canonical because they have the status of tradition and are distinctly South African. They are social forms because they are not fully social forms because they are not fully comprehended as social institutions, that is, within the state, formal boxes with rules and membership, nor as economic firms, that is, a firm doing business. Each is a structural analog of the other, characterized by a single patriarchal head with absolute but always contested authority. A large tract of land with a residential, precarious, and apparently voluntary population, whose tenure, livelihood, and settlement pattern is determined partly by rational, that is economic, means, and partly by traditional criteria, and administered by a devolved set of managers or indunas or indeed chiefs, encompassing infrastructure, industrial, farming, and administrative, labor, residences, shops, distinctive identity, and is relatively autonomous as a form of social order, reporting ideally to the state, but often operating independently of it. Their mutual dependency contributes to their exceptional resilience. With different historical origins, they have converged to structures that resemble the African and Afrikaans historical household. Their structural similarity allows them to merge, as when a farm becomes a chiefship under land redistribution, or when a chiefship becomes a mine, the Royal Bafokeng example in this case, and there are others. In more metaphorical terms, we can see that these social forms also contribute to broad political agendas, such as Jacob Zuma's reliance on his base in rural chiefships, Cyril Ramaphosa's reliance on his background in the mines, and Julius Malema's retreat to the land question and capture of farms. So in some ways, they hold the state captive already. And there are a number of ways in which these canonical social forms, because they are opaque to the state, to law, and to social science, have a very important role in state capture. So almost from its inception, social science in South Africa has, and before that, has been mainly concerned with governance and resistance on the one hand, urban versus rural, or African versus black versus European versus white, and then relations between these categories, and between civil society and the state, between the categories that emerged out of these historical processes, race, class, age, etc., generation. In most instances, the state and civil society are portrayed as being in conflict. This is also true for most of the emergent social categories. But the categories and the conflictual oppositions they imply arise from specific historical experience of Europe, as Akhil Gupta remarks in an article called Blurred Boundaries. He's also an anthropologist. Blurred Boundaries, the discourse of corruption, the culture of politics, and the imagined state in India. Gupta's worry is that the categories of state, civil society, and governance are applied universally. That is, he argues that the Western, here we read Marx, Durkheim, Weber, etc., categories are not universal. And by ignoring the ways in which the culture of politics and the way in which the state is imagined within other political cultures will blind us to more complex or other realities. So what I'm arguing here is that the state, the farm, and the mine are these cultural, they really exist out there, but we imagine them in particular ways, and we imagine the state in particular ways. So this is what in anthropology we've been calling different social ontologies, what different cultures, different groups of people imagine to be really real. That is what we will commit to have a relationship to. That's how we can define a social ontology. So in the last 50 years or so, heated concern with the state has been the central pivot of South African social science. The three central issues, that is the state and its oppositions, the categories, race, class, urban, rural, etc., and the relations between these. So virtually all South African social science can be phrased as the relation between category X and category Y, or between the state and category X or category Y, and so on and so forth. So that characterizes South, and for the most part, it's about South Africa rather than the rest of the world. In the most recent few years, however, great attention and concern has attended the capture of the state by ex-President Jacob Zuma, the Gupta brothers from India, and their kin, cronies, and enablers. It might be argued that the state has been captured several times before, but the difference in the current state of affairs is the largely criminal network of actors and interests and the sophisticated corruption and extraction of massive state resources by the recent Zupta regime, also its internationalization and its financialization at the international or global level. Corruption has not been limited to the Zuptas, although they seem to have led the ravening pack that includes other parties, movements, and organizations of varying kinds. The Zuptas, however, seem to have got away with more swag than other organizations or previous administrations. The intensity of the attention paid to these and other main themes has left out of focus a number of other issues. There are several familiar social forms of South African life that have largely escaped the gaze of the social sciences. This is in part because they do not fit the expected pattern of state and civil institutions that form the backbone of Euro-American social theory in South Africa. They are effectively indigenous in that their uniquely South African social forms have emerged from the often chaotic historical and social formation of South African society as a whole. So these are the farm, the mine, and the chiefdom. I suggest a way that we can understand state capture and its aftermath by offering what I call a different social ontology. A social ontology is a way of saying what kinds of social things we believe are really real. That is, what types of social forms we may form solid commitments to because we believe that we stand in a permanent, that is, really real relationship with them. So the social ontology of the South African farm, the mine, and the chiefdom are fundamental South African social forms, even though they are also black boxes, neither fully economic firms, political entities like counties or provinces or parties, nor institutions. These are social realities that we all know about, but occupy a problematic place in the standard social theories of politics, sociology, anthropology, and history. Obviously, they are not fully describable in terms of the canonical social analytic categories of race, gender, class, religion, age, ethnicity, etc. These are primary categories in terms of which we generally organize our thought. But specifically, these are not administrative categories of the state apparatus, even though they have a prominent function in political discourse. Finally, they are not simply emergent forms of colonialism, racism, sexism, or perhaps some other ism. The farm, the mine, and the chiefdom are, however, prominent in the narratives and processes of South African state capture.
Robert, you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. So they're fundamental in social discourse. Let's take 3 examples. Ramaphosa focuses and comes from the mine. This is the basis of his personal enrichment and political ascendancy, the source of a quintessential South African identity, the mine and the laborer. So this is Ramaphosa's ascendancy and base, how he captures resources. For Zuma, the chiefdom has been the ultimate retreat, as retreat now, having left the presidency, but also the retreat of the ANC from the urban to the rural, and of Zuma's own escape hatch. He has ascended primarily by representing himself as the Zulu boy, that is, as the traditional Zulu man, the man from the chiefdom, from the rural area, as the real Zulu. And then Malema. Malema focuses on the land, the idea here of the land being capture of the farm. We all know that what he's talking about when he says the land really is the farm. as promised, this is a kind of millenarianism, a telos of economic freedom. Economic freedom, of course, is an oxymoron. Economics, by definition, cannot offer freedom. And you know, the sort of myth of everything for free. So these forms are not institutions, and they're not organs of the state. The farm and the chiefship are historically the first instances of Southern African social order. The first Dutch government in the Cape developed the farm as a mechanism for land appropriation. Farms also served as the lowest level of government and as the productive agricultural enterprise. They were the source for mounted commandos that served for the colonial state to exercise its power. This blend of political, economic, and cultural forms in a geographically delimited and legal entity gave the South African farm its distinctive character. It was nominally owned by a white, mostly Dutch-speaking male, who may or may not have been actually present. The farm, however, encompassed previously existing polities of indigenous African people on the land so demarcated. Other people became resident on the farm in many capacities as managers, sharecroppers, herdsmen, artisans, common laborers, transport riders, and members of local militias known as commanders. Weak patrilineages of farm owners developed, while junior non-inheriting sons and families hived off to found other farms or become managers, governors, professionals, and civil elites throughout what eventually became South Africa. Now, more or less the same thing happened for the mine. Generally, the mines were created by claiming a prospecting area, a ground that would be claimed. Now, then, you know, in under-industrial mining, which emerged very, very quickly from the first discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa, the mine owns a large, often many farms, that has the same characteristic of the farm itself, an apical head and a rough hierarchy, which is never really a hierarchy, because there's labor, there are other people, there are many other different forms of social conflict and social disorder within the mine. Thus we see on the mine constant conflict, and you know, the way this has been handled in the sort of ordinary social science of South Africa has been as an opposition between capital and labor, which has ignored, of course, all of the other smaller activities that have made mining possible. And I'm currently looking at earlier pre-colonial indigenous mining enterprises and how those became integrated, or what their line is into current capital-intensive industrial mining. And that's taking me in some very interesting places too. Then finally, the chiefdom, let me say, in terms of how these things work, let's take the farm for an example. The mine is not just a mining enterprise. There are many, many different things that go on within the mine grounds. It's a residential area. It has an industry, but there are also a number of other industries, shop, working, making the metal, making the tools, all of that, and providing the sustenance and wherewithal for the labor and the managers and everybody else to get there, to get around and to live on the mining grounds. But if we look at the farm, for instance, the farm today is not based in agriculture. So agricultural training is really going to do nothing to make farms work. The way farms actually work on the ground, and I'm talking from experience here, you know, I spent time at farms. Farms sell sand, for instance, informal mining. They sell firewood, for instance, informal resource extraction. There are many spaza shops. There are people doing all sorts of different things, from operating wedding venues to tailoring enterprises, or making small goods and distributing those. Agriculture, small agriculture, large-scale agriculture, at many different scales. So the idea that the farm is an agricultural enterprise is simply wrong. It's not, except in some very limited, hyper sort of capital-intensive examples where where farming, especially maize farming, occupies the whole thing. So what makes the farm work, what makes the mine work, what makes the chiefdom work is many different kinds of social organization, kinds of different economic organizations, all folded into one. They become canonical in the South African social organization because this is what we think South Africa is, the mine, the farm. And they are the locations of where the swag gets distributed. So Estina Farm, the Marikana, not Marikana, Nkandla as the chiefdom, or as a quasi-chiefdom, and a number of other mines, the fact that the Guptas buy mines, coal mines and uranium mines. In other words, these social forms, these canonical forms, are where the state swag gets redistributed. So, or gets distributed into the economy in these sort of secret ways. So they are very important in terms of defining the South African state, defining how the state thinks of itself, in other words, political culture, and where the goods of the state go.
Thank you. Okay, let's open up for discussion right away. I'm seeing some really nice disagreements already beginning to get going on this panel. Okay, let's start.
Thank you very much. Very interesting conversation, I must say. And I have I'm not sure if it's questions or comments. There's some parts that I strongly disagree with, and there's some parts that I may align with. Anyway, so let's start with the man. I am in agreement with you in a number of things. I'm originally from the Eastern Cape, so I understand the context within which you derive from. And yes, we do recognize the interdependence of the state and traditional leadership as we've now come to know it. And that for me is squarely where the problem is. Because in a constitutional democracy that's trying very hard to espouse constitutional values and the principles encouched in the Constitution comes in conflict with the values that the system of traditional rules espouses, whatever those may be. But my experience, and especially that derived from my work, comes in conflict. And so if we're looking at state capture and what we need to put in place to ensure that it doesn't happen again, we can't have that conversation without shaking the structures and the foundation of the traditional system as it stands. So we can't accept it as it is. We gotta grapple with it, we gotta shake it up, we gotta interrogate it and put it up to the mirror and look at what is it that is coming into conflict with the vision of South Africa as we see it, and can we continue with it as it is? And I actually would like to agree with you around this thing that's in our legislation. I don't even want to, like, there's like a clause, it's not even a clause, it's like an underwritten principle and a rule that allows traditional leaders space to deliver basic services, to administer land, to do a whole lot of things in the space where they have jurisdiction. And they can do this by raising their own resources. But then there are no accountability mechanisms put in place. And so if you're in government, there's an auditor general. If you're in business, there's a king called whole set of rules, I'd go with that. But if you're in the traditional space, there's nothing. And we're not asking the questions that we need to ask around how do we hold this thing to account. And yeah, so I don't agree. Well, they do link to our sense of community, sense of past, sense of belonging, and sense of who we are. But going forward, we've got to ask the critical and the uncomfortable questions that force us at times to grapple with our own identity and our own ideals and our own values going forward.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My question is a little bit off topic, but still aligned. I just wanted to ask, under what context can economics not offer us freedom once we do have the land for a second? So under what context can economics not offer us freedom if we do have the land eventually, for example?
Thank you. Sarah. Can we get some responses?
Okay, I think that there are a couple here for me. The first is on the question of chiefly reform, or the implication that chiefs need to reform. You're absolutely right. Chiefs absolutely do have to reform, and in line with the Constitution. And municipal officials and local leaders, traditional leaders, if you like, have to find ways of cooperating. It was precisely what I was trying to delineate, that area is a problem. And until they cooperate, until they pull in the same way, there will be no economic change, no proper rural governance in those areas. And again, this is the point. Some chiefs have hunkered down and don't want to reform. Other chiefs are moving forward and saying, we really want to do this. Let's try and do it. So there is unevenness, huge unevenness across regions, but chiefly reform is absolutely essential. You cannot have a constitution pulling in the nation in one direction and chiefs pulling in another direction. It's a disaster for everybody. So I'm completely on the same page with you. The second question was about how can economics not offer freedom once you've got the land? Well, the question is, what is economics? And what is farming economics? Robert said that farming doesn't occur on land, and I'll come to that in a moment. But clearly, if your land is not going to be productive, it is not of very much economic benefit. So economics needs to be worked out in relation to that land, and that is what I was saying, and that is what people in the rural Eastern Cape believe very strongly. They often hark back to the agricultural schemes of the Bantustan era and say, we got seeds, we got plowing assistance, we had excellent crops here. So agricultural support is very much a cry on the part of rural Eastern Cape. The problem is that you don't hear it in the political speak of the major political parties. That's the problem. For them, the land itself is the magic bullet. But people who are sitting without land or overcrowded on land are desperate to be able to do something on that land. And here I want to disagree very strongly with Robert. In the rural Eastern Cape, people are farming. There are no trees left to sell wood from. People are burning cow dung for fuel. There is a little bit of grass when it rains. People are selling wool clips in many areas. The Somali traders are making a killing out of buying the wool clip a couple of times a year and selling off that wool. People are planting maize in some areas where the fences are still up and where they can get some kind of support from the local leader, from tractors who come via the municipal authority, from the chief who supports the fencing operations and so on. So there's a great deal of agricultural activity going on in these areas, but it's uneven. In some instances it's collapsed, but that's the vision that people have for themselves. They don't want to simply park on this land. So economics has to be a kind of productive economics related to making use of the land as a resource, and then economics will deliver freedom. But it has to be a planned and productive economics. And in the rural Eastern Cape, certainly it's about real farming activity. The shebeens and the spaza shops are pretty much the only two alternatives in vast areas that are far away from towns, that are far away from any other kinds of markets. So it's about distance to markets, it's about distance to main roads, it's about distance to all sorts of alternatives that determine what it is you want to use your land for. So again, there's no one recipe, no one size fits all, and it has to be locally sorted out. And that's why so much work is needed, because there isn't simply one blueprint that can fit everywhere.
Okay.
Well, sorry, you're going to go.
Okay. First of all, with regards to, the question with regards to whether we need to scrap or we should continue to maintain, or whether we should put maybe a glass, or maybe whether we should reassess the institution of leadership. I completely, totally agree with it, because even in the South African Local Government Act, chiefs are allowed to even bid for tender. That is the clause is that if you have the means. And in most cases, some chiefs do not have the means. Therefore, they serve as front for certain individuals, including, I don't want to mention names. So this sort of fronting actually breeds of, enhances corruption in certain aspects. So that notwithstanding, I think it's important in some cases also, there are some chiefs who wish, or they assume that, they can perform better than the local government officials. Therefore, when the local government officials will be put in place certain mechanisms, then they mobilize their people to secretly go and destroy or counter those kind of efforts which is actually being taken by the local government officials. So I think it is important that chiefs, to some extent, if we don't want to scrap them, then they should partner with the local government officials to move forward the visions of their people. Now, the question is not addressed to me with regards to the gentleman's question, economics and land. I somewhat agree with you, and I somewhat disagree with you. My position is clear that land plays a very important role in a nation's development, no matter how you want to argue it. For instance, in the U.S., when the slavery was abolished, black people were given the slavery was abolished. Black people were left to go and fend for themselves without land. But how can you give someone freedom without giving the person land to feed on, land to grow food and to survive on? And I think that same plays out within the context that we find ourselves here. Individuals have the freedom, but there is massive unemployment. people do not have do not have the land to produce the food they want to consume. So then what will happen? It means that it is going to trigger crime. Now, I believe that if, I do have 2 daughters, and I believe that some of us, if your daughter gets to the age of probably around 24, and your daughter comes to you that, oh, I want to now be on my own, I want to go and have my own family, I think as a father, you will agree. And I believe that's the context we find South Africa in. The country is plus minus 20 years, 24 years. And I think the time has come for her to take its rightful place in the community of nations. If it says that I've come of age, therefore I need the land to plant my own crops, it's like you come to me and you want to borrow this glass of water. And then 20 years, I come to you and you say, no, 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 okay, it's 20 years, but this glass of water, you see that I've decorated it nicely. I don't think you are capable of maintaining it the way I have done, so go back and come at some other time. I think it's going to make people upset. So maybe the time has come for people, the rightful owners, if they desire to reclaim what belongs to them. I think it's not something which is far-fetched or which is out of context. And then if they believe that they have acquired the necessary skills, I believe, as was said by Kwame Nkrumah some almost 60 years ago, that I would prefer to make my own mistakes. Give me my country and let me make my own mistakes, and I will learn through my mistakes. I believe the time has come for people to secure because if they within them as individuals, they believe that I have the inherent right, or I believe that this is going to liberate me, why don't you give the people that opportunity for them to liberate themselves? And if they make the mistakes, I believe eventually they will learn from the mistakes, and then learn from the mistakes and improve their situation. So to me, I believe that land and economics or prosperity, they are tied together. They are inseparable. I will conclude there.
Okay, well, let me start with the economic and the land issues. The person who asked, yeah. The problem is we conflate or really confuse the land idea with agriculture. And farms that are still operating or that are operating as farms actually survive. And then most of them are very, very marginal, unless we're looking at the large-scale, capital-intensive maize plantations, for instance, and other things, grape farming in the Western Cape. Most of them are very marginal, and they function through really a fairly unstructured set of economic practices that change with the climate, change with the part of the country they're in, but also include things like crime. Farms are often, because they're isolated, because it's very difficult for cops to get into a farm, they're prime places to base your criminal activity. And many farms actually function in that way, even if it's a very minor crime like selling sand, which is mining. And is against the law to actually mine without a license, to sort of major things basing your automobile theft racket on a farm. All of these happen on farms, and those are extreme examples. But to say that it's simply agriculture is wrong. Now, it is certainly true that if you ask farmers if they want to farm on land, they say yes. If you ask farmers on land, what are you doing? They say farm. But if you ask mechanics what they're doing, they're repairing the tractors. If you ask truck drivers what they're doing, they're driving the trucks. If you ask the spaza shop over at the Somalis, whatever, they're doing other things. So there are many, the economy is very complex, and many farms function on that basis. In other words, they are deliberately opaque. They cannot admit to the way that they are actually structured, the way their economy is actually works, or pay the amount of taxes that would be legally incumbent upon them, because then they would not function, because they're that marginal. Also because a number of things that they actually do to make them work is not legal. And that's why, for instance, the Guptas are very keen to get mines They're very keen to get farms. Why? Because those are very difficult to account for, or to actually have oversight. What happens on the farm stays on the farm. What happens on the mine stays on the mine. It's very difficult to actually know what's going on. And you can see that from our South African social analysis. We talk about very general things, but the detailed way in which a chief operating sort of behind a blanket of secrecy actually runs his household through farming, some of it, but certainly not all of it. He probably owns taxis. He's in the transport business. He owns rental properties. He's renting. He's doing a number of different things, all behind a veil of secrecy that we as social scientists or as the state cannot penetrate. So to say that the chief must reform or that the chief must cooperate, that's an impossibility because the chiefship is built, in many cases, the actual functioning of actual chiefs. I'm not talking in abstract terms. I'm talking about actual functioning of real chiefs, people that I know. If they were simply transparently cooperating with the masipala, the municipality, they would be a great deal poorer and in many cases in jail. So that idea of cooperation and collaboration, it's wonderful, it's nice, maybe we can make it happen, but that's not what is happening now. And there are very, very important reasons why it cannot happen under the current sort of situation for many years to come. There was, I think that basically covers a number of the questions here. Why not institutions? Why am I not talking about institutions? That's important. I'm talking about social forms because in terms of social theory of institutions, an institution has a boundary. It has its membership is countable in principle, which is not true of a network, for instance. A network is uncountable in principle because it always can add another member. Farms, mines, they all work through a combination of institutionality and network, as well as a number of other kinds of organizations, including genealogical, friendship, sex, sexual networks, all of which make these kinds of social forms work. They're not institutions in the Weberian sense. They're not economies in a Marxian or formal economic sense. Even sort of certainly not a modern economistic sense or economy. So what are they? They are imagined. Above all, they're part of the South African cultural imagination of itself. The mine, the farm, and the chiefdom. Not entirely. They have property. They are real things. They have legal identities. But there's a great deal that goes on that is actually there, that is well beyond the theoretical or legal sort of vision that we have.
Before I come to you, Leroux, may I just abuse my position for a moment and slip in a question here? I'm finding what you're saying, Robert, very provocative. And I want to turn the question around to ask about the state. If you're saying the opacity of the chiefship, etc., is what make them function the way that they do. I mean, the point you made in response to Nontandu about how if we wanted to reform them, they wouldn't operate the way they do, and for many years to come, they won't. I'm wondering whether we can't say the same of the state, of state institutions, that kind of opacity is also, I think, maybe even an integral part of how state institutions themselves operate. And I'm wondering then where that puts us when we're thinking about how these various forms interrelate, and especially when it comes to the point of, I mean, I also found your point, Nontando, very provocative, that we cannot think about state capture and pushing back against that state capture without really contesting what the role of traditional authorities looks like vis-a-vis the municipality, vis-a-vis other forms, to use that term. I mean, and I think that's right, that there's a contest here. It's been going on for a long time, and there's a way in which that contest can be sharpened in the way that Nontando suggests. So I'm wondering then if these things are all opaque in the way, if we accept that the state itself is opaque in a similar way, whether that contestation that Nontando suggests vis-a-vis the chieftainship is something that's possible and is something that we can and should, in fact, I think in fighting against state capture, be going back to that conversation. What is the place of the chiefs? And in a constitutional democracy, if we're committed to that vision, what do we do? How do we contest? It's something that's as opaque as you say it is.
Okay, well, I think the opacity of the state is modeled on the opacity of the farm, the mine, and the chiefdom. In other words, this is the historical basis for the emergence of the South African state.
Maybe
It's the state emerges from built on the farm, especially the old the Transvaal state and